In woodworking, there's no such thing as perfect wood. So you need to learn how to work with wood defects. I'm Travis, this is how I do things, and I'm gonna show you guys how to use terrible wood. I went to Home Depot in search of the worst wood I could find to show you guys how to deal with the most common defects you might encounter. Obviously, it'd be so much easier just to buy good wood, right? Sometimes inventory can be low and you need to work with whatever wood you can find. And then other times you might put good wood on the shelf and it might not be good anymore. Some of the main types of wood defects are knots, cupped, crooked, bowed, twisted, split, or checked. Be sure to stick around for the entire video because I'm going to discuss all of these defects as well as how to prevent them and then give you some techniques on how to use wood that already has these defects. But before I go into detail about all the possible wood defects, I want to quickly discuss wood storage. If you bought some nice straight wood and you want to keep it that way, it's best to store it in a way that allows it to dry slowly and evenly. Wood is like a sponge and it naturally wants to try to match the environment that it's in. So if at all possible, try to set your humidity in your shop to be similar to wherever your final product will be. That way, maybe your project won't change quite as much when you move it from your shop to inside your home. You should always let any wood that you buy acclimate to your shop's humidity for at least a couple of days before working with it. As you can tell by the sweat on my face, my shop has zero climate control. So I actually moved my wood inside of my home to acclimate for a few days before working with it. I would also recommend picking up a moisture meter like this one right here. I put a link to this one in the video description. To use this moisture meter, you simply place it on the board that you're about to use. And ideally for woodworking, you want to see between 6 and 10%. And you can see why I say ideally. You kind of need to work with what you got. My shop has no climate control and this board still was below 6%. So you kind of never know exactly what you're going to get until you test it, but you also kind of need to work with what you have. The first type of defect I want to talk about is a knot. It's a totally natural defect and it's where a tree branch used to grow from. Some knots are tight and it can be left alone, but then some knots are loose and they need to be addressed or they may fall out later. Because a knot is a totally natural defect, you pretty much can't prevent it. But if you have a project that requires knot-free wood, you're just going to have to be very selective when picking your wood. But if you do have a board that has knots in it, there are a few different ways you can deal with it. You can try to design around the knot by cutting shorter pieces out of the wood that will allow you to cut the knots completely out. If it's a tight knot and you like the look, you could do nothing. Knots add lots of character. If you have a loose knot but you want to keep it, you could stabilize it. My go-to method for doing this is with CA glue. You can get it in clear, black, brown, and it keeps the knot without having to worry about it falling out later. I don't use a lot of epoxy, but you could also use that to stabilize a knot. When a board looks like this, that defect is called cupped. Basically, cupped means that one of the faces of the board is hollowed out. To prevent this, you could go to a sawmill and try to request quarter sawn boards. Most boards will have an end grain kind of like this. That's from the sawmill cutting up the log like this. This is the easiest way for the sawmill to quickly process that log, but it leads to kind of an unstable board and will eventually cup. Quarter sawn wood is when the boards are cut out of the log like this, and the end grain typically looks a lot like this. And the finished product is a board that's way more predictable and far less likely to cup. But quarter sawn boards can be expensive and hard to find. You could also try to buy wider boards that have more quarter sawn sections on the ends. Then you could cut out the part in the middle that is more likely to warp. You can flatten the board with a planer, but if you do, plane both sides, you open up the grain of the wood on both faces. If you open up the grain on just one side, it could cup again. Also, try to use your newly flattened board immediately after planing it. That way all the other joints and boards in your project will help keep it flat. Also, when you're finishing your final project, be sure to apply that finish to both sides. That will help prevent one side from absorbing more moisture than the other. This board has a very exaggerated crook in it. A crook is when the board is warped along one of its edges. Your best bet is to not even buy boards like this and try to buy straight boards. And when you buy those straight boards, be sure to store them the way I showed you earlier. But if you need to use a board like this, I would recommend trying to use it in shorter pieces to reduce the amount of overall crook in your workpiece. And you're still going to want to put a straight edge on that board before you use it. But now that the board is so short, it has very little crook in it and will waste very little material. You can put a straight edge on this board by temporarily screwing or gluing a straight board to it, or you could use a jig like this to hold the board so you can cut a straight edge with your table saw. By the way, I have plans for this jig on my website. And then use your new straight edge as a reference for your second edge. Now that you've straightened both edges of this board, you should be able to use it, but you want to use it right away or it may crook again. A bowed board is one that is warped in the face like this. This board was probably stored in a way that caused it to dry faster on one side, which shows why it's so critical to make sure your boards dry evenly on all sides. Once again, you can try to use this board in smaller pieces to minimize the difficulty of working with bowed wood. And you might be able to design your project to use a board like this by attaching it to another board to pull it straight. And lastly, you could use a thickness planer and a planer sled to make the board flat again. The idea is to fully support the board on your planer sled and then run it through the planer to give you one perfectly flat side. And then take the board off the planer sled and run the other side through the planer to make it parallel to the flattened side. And this is an example of a twisted board. A twisted board is a board that is warped around the center axis of the board. The best way to prevent having to work with a twisted board is to obviously not buy a twisted board, buy a straight one, and then store and dry your straight board properly. You guys sense a theme yet? I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, but it's best to cut a twisted board into smaller pieces if possible to minimize the effect of the twist. And if you have good straight boards, be sure to save those for your longer cuts. And once you minimize the twist by cutting the board shorter, go ahead and bust out that thickness planer and that planer sled again, and then make it flat just like we did the bowed board earlier. Well, as you all know from earlier in the video, as moisture levels change in a board, it will expand and contract. Expanding and contracting can cause your board to split like this one right here. A split is when there's a crack in the board that goes all the way through. And if you want to try to prevent this on the wood you're storing, try to keep your area at a relatively consistent humidity level. And if you want to try to prevent this on a finished project, make sure you finish all of the sides to keep a constant level of moisture on all sides of the boards. It's also important to understand the way that wood grows and contracts. So when you build your project, it won't tear itself apart. A good example of this is when you're building a table with breadboard ends. The breadboard ends will be growing and contracting at a different rate than the rest of the table. If the wood you've selected for your project has a split in it, it can be dealt with similar to a knot. If possible, try to figure out a way to design around the split and cut it off completely. You could also try to repair the split with wood glue and clamps. And if the project you're working on is more rustic or painted, you could just stabilize the split with CA glue or epoxy. But I would only recommend that if the split doesn't go all the way to one of the ends. But if your crack does go all the way to an end, it's best to either cut it off or stabilize it with some sort of more mechanical method, like bow ties, and then fill with epoxy. So these are just my opinions on how to deal with tearable wood. You may have your own opinions, but in the end, wood is natural and it's going to move, it's going to have defects. But if you know of any defects that I might have missed, or you have other ways you like to deal with them, please drop that in the comments below. Wow, you made it through my entire video. Congratulations. Seeing as how you liked it so much, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe and watch another cool video up here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.